Hello and welcome back to the IEA YouTube channel. I'm Emily Carver, Head of Media at the IEA. Today we're going to be discussing the wonderful island nation of New Zealand. Over the course of the past 2 years, lots of us have become particularly interested in the country, its politics, and in particular, its government's COVID strategy, which has been both a subject of admiration and also great concern. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been hailed by many as a progressive icon who has fostered a kinder society. Others have criticised her authoritarian approach during the pandemic and argued that she puts virtue signalling ahead of substance. She swept to power, of course, on a wave of popular support to become New Zealand's Prime Minister, aged only 37. But why is she so popular and what exactly has she achieved? Is it fair to say her COVID strategy has been a success, or has it been a cruel experiment with dire consequences? Polls have shown her popularity is dipping, but does she still carry the support of the majority of Kiwis? And is there any hope for the centre-right to win back power? Today I'm joined by Jamie Whyte, author, former leader of the ACT Party in New Zealand and former research director at the IEA. I'm also joined by Sam Collins, a fellow Kiwi and senior advisor to the IEA's Director General, Mark Littlewood. If you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up, comment below and subscribe to our channel. Hi guys.
Morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Jamie, can I start with you? Lots of our viewers, including myself, won't be particularly clued up about the state of politics in New Zealand. Could you give us a little bit of a, basic overview of what the situation is, what parties we've got, and whether there's that usual sort of left-right dynamic?
Sure. I'll start actually I can do that by correcting something you said in your introduction, which was that Jacinda Ardern was stormed to power 4.5 years ago in her first term on a wave of popular support. The story is actually slightly different. What happened was that leading into the election, her party, the Labour Party, was doing very poorly. They were polling in the 20s, and they had a Richard Little, I think is, if I remember correctly, was the leader, a former trade union lawyer. He wasn't doing very well. And with only about 6 weeks to go to the election, they swapped in Jacinda Ardern to be the leader. And she did do very well. She gained about 10 percentage points in the polls. But she still came in the election results, she still got far less than the National Party, who had been in charge. If I recall the final numbers, she got about 30, Labour got 30s. We have a proportional representation system, which I'll come to. She got about 36, 37% of the vote. National got about 43, 44, something like that. So you would think National would win. Getting 44% of the vote is really an amazing achievement in a proportional representation system. But what actually happened is that there's another party in New Zealand, been around for a long time, called New Zealand First, and they're usually in Parliament. They tend to get about 8% of the vote in elections, and they're led by a chap, or were led by a chap, called God, I'm blanking. What's his name?
Winston Peters.
Winston Peters. I'm going mad.
Oh, there we
go. Been around forever. Now, New Zealand, Winston Peters is a very charismatic chap who's been in politics for a long time, and he's really on the nationalist right. He's a kind of populist nationalist. He hated the National Party, in particular the leadership of the National Party at the time. And Jacinda Ardern did a deal with him and the Greens to become the former government, become the Prime Minister. And I think this should make people realize that she's not quite the paragon of leftist virtue that she pretends to be, because she was willing to do a deal with Winston Peters, who is really, sometimes he's overtly racist, especially against Chinese. And he's really a thug and exactly the kind of politician that you would think that if somebody virtuous like Jacinda Ardern wouldn't get into bed with. But she did become Prime Minister.
Sorry, is he, what's his equivalent sort of in UK politics, would you say?
Nigel Farage, I suppose, would be the closest
Nigel
thing.
Farage.
He's not as, I was going to say he's not as eloquent as Nigel Farage, but that's not true. Actually, Winston Peters is rather eloquent. He's very effective in media, with the press. He's actually very combative. He's gone now. He's very old. And his party's in disarray, I believe. So just to give you the spectrum, yes, we do have a left-right thing in New Zealand. You've got two parties on the right, the National Party, which is on the right. They're one of these parties that's got no ideological core of any kind. They represent They've been traditionally the party of farmers and businessmen. And then you've got the Labour Party, which is on the left. It's a much more interesting party in many ways. Almost all the developments in New Zealand, all the changes have been made by the Labour Party, and then the National Party comes in afterwards and accepts them all. That's really the pattern of New Zealand policy formation. Fortunately, there was one Labour Party in the 1980s which made an enormous number of free market liberal kinds of reforms, which is really why New Zealand's the country it is today. They utterly transformed the place, and there's been a bit of backpedaling, but not too much. So New Zealand is still basically an open liberal economy. So you've got National and Labour at the centre of the left-right thing. Then you've got to the left of Labour, you've got the Greens, and they're watermelon Greens. That's to say, they're not just concerned with the environment. They're also very concerned with social justice and race issues and all the kinds of things that you would expect. So they tend to be a little to the left of Labour. And then you've got to the right, or to the free market right of National, my old party, ACT, which is doing very well at the moment, really way up in the polls. The poll as high as 16%, which is the record for them. And then the other element in New Zealand politics, we had this New Zealand Party thing, which was kind of populist party, populist nationalist, anti-free trade, anti-immigration, all that kind of thing. Wanted to go back to the pre-80s era of New Zealand, the way New Zealand was. A lot of old people supported it, tend to be old and low income. And then they're a diminishing presence now. And then the other element in New Zealand politics, which is worth noting, is the Maori element. There's something called the Maori Party. And there was another party, I don't know if they've bounced back, there was another Maori party for a while, called Mana, I think. And they are an interesting influence, which is they tend to be socially conservative. Maori are often Christian, and the Maori bigwigs and Maori politicians worry about the state of the Maori population, their health, their education levels, and because they're concerned about that kind of thing, they tend to have kind of what you might call socially conservative response. For example, legalizing drugs in New Zealand was something I thought would have happened long ago, but it hasn't happened, and I discovered why when I was in politics in New Zealand, which is that the Maori political movement are dead against it because they think it would cause trouble with their population. So that's the basic picture of New Zealand politics and the spectrum. And at the moment, it's dominated by the left, so the Labour Party Green coalition. But frustration with what's been going on over the last 2 years has led to a resurgence in, well, ACT, I said, is doing very well. National have been doing very poorly under its previous leader, Judith Collins, who's a brute of a woman, kind of bash him up, kind of, again, a bit thuggish. There's been a trend in New Zealand politics to have these brutes to leading parties. There was a guy, Rob Muldoon, who set the tone in New Zealand politics in the 70s. Oh, just the most awful man. Really nasty, nasty piece of work, who lowered the tone of discussion. And there was the people who liked him called themselves Rob's mob, and they were a bloody mob. So she was in that tradition. She didn't do very well. And they've got a new leader now, and they've had a bounce on the back of that. We'll see how he goes. He's a slightly odd chap. He's rich businessman, but also a fundamentalist Christian. So we'll see. It's early days.
Fundamentalist Christian, wow. Well, it seems like there's a very intricate patchwork of different political views in New Zealand. Sam,
there's proportional representation for you.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very complicated. I wonder, particularly considering the way that Jacinda Ardern has dealt with the pandemic. Firstly, does she still hold? Are most people in favour of the way she's handled the pandemic? I know over in the UK and across the Western world, many were hailing her as being, kind and thinking and, saving lives and being an example of how a leader should, deal with a pandemic. I think, Guardian columnist after Guardian columnist has said she's the woman you want to deal with a crisis and so on, and that she's created a kinder country that's, different from Australia and much nicer to live in. Sam, is there a backlash growing against that? Is that why the ACT Party has gained popularity? Is it against the lockdown mentality and the lockdown restrictions?
Yeah, I think, New Zealand's had a bit of a history with leaders becoming very popular after disasters of various sorts. I mean, the previous Prime Minister, John Key, who I should say for fairness, that I was a former candidate for the New Zealand National Party, so I'm not completely unbiased on, and I'm not sure I would agree with all of Jamie's characterizations of my party. But previous Prime Minister John Key, in the immediate aftermath of the Christchurch earthquake, which is where I'm from, there's a tendency for New Zealanders to sort of rally around the leader, or even within just a region, and when a disaster occurs. And I think even more strongly in large countries like the UK. I always think about comparing New Zealand to Scotland a bit. And when you look at the response of Scots to how they see Nicola Sturgeon, and it's quite similar, the response for New Zealanders. There's a lot of rally around the flag, and Jacinda, I'm sure, I think, Jamie, you know her better than I do, but she is actually a very, very nice woman by all accounts. She is, when she puts her arms around people and says, she wants to look after them and wants to make them feel better, she actually means it. She's a very fundamentally kind person. And so I think she was in a very good position to take advantage of, and I don't mean take advantage deliberately, but to reap the rewards of a natural disaster occurring. I think on your on what's happening now, I think the problem for her is that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was probably about 30 to 40% of people who were 110% behind. Let's do this. We're team. I think the slogan was, "We're a team of 6 million" or something like that. Let's do this. Let's get it done. Let's do whatever we have to do to stop this pandemic. There was a much smaller group, I would say probably only 5 or 6% to start off with, who were militantly opposed to the government's COVID policy. And then the remainder was sort of a bit of a, blamongy, oh, well, we'll do what the government says because, they're the government and they know best type thing. And the problem for Jacinda is that that blamongy centre has been moving away from her. So we've seen it with the ACT Party going from, I can't quite remember the exact numbers, but I think at the beginning of the pandemic, they were polling around 5%, and now they're up at, I think, 16%. Labour managed to score an absolute majority at the last general election, more than 50% of the vote, which has never happened in a general election in New Zealand since we introduced MMP. In fact, I think it only happened once previously in New Zealand's history, going back to 1952 or something like that. Jamie, I don't know if you know off the top of your head. It was whenever the waterfront strike was, anyway. So that blamongy group has been moving away from her and started becoming a lot more angry. So you're seeing it anecdotally. People who were who were sort of contented to just let the government do what they were doing. They didn't really hurt them all that much. Do our bit for the rest of the population. Some of them are starting to get very, very angry, and I think that's going to be a real problem for Jacinda going forward.
Yeah, I mean, Jamie, I think it's probably useful for our viewers to just hear, just very briefly, what exactly was Jacinda Ardern's strategy? Did she have a strategy from the start? What is it always, elimination of COVID, zero COVID? Was that her strategy? I know that she's pivoted slightly now. Can people return to New Zealand at this stage? What's the situation right now?
Well, you're right. It was originally zero COVID or elimination. And the policy was to close the borders and to be free inside, insofar as there was no COVID. The minute COVID popped up, any cases, quite severe lockdowns were imposed. So that was a zero COVID strategy. I remember tweeting really early on when they adopted this, something like, this is a huge bet on vaccines coming along quickly. And I got piled on, granny killer, all that kind of stuff. But what was most peculiar about it is that though it looks like it was a bet on that, New Zealand didn't make any preparations to get the vaccines. It was one of the slowest countries in the Western world to roll out the vaccine thing, which is really odd considering they seem to have made a big punt on the vaccines coming along. So then it turned out that they couldn't even seal the border. So it did get in. The cases were taking off, and it started to become very clear that there was you can't eliminate COVID. You certainly can't eliminate COVID if you're a country of 5 million at the bottom of the South Pacific. It's just becoming global. It's everywhere. But as far as I can tell, at the moment, they're in a strange kind of in-between state where they've given up on the idea that they're going to eliminate it. That they can't. They're in a kind of partial lockdown thing. They've got a traffic light system. I think they're in orange at the moment. And but the border's still sealed, more or less. I mean, if you want to go to New Zealand, even as a New Zealander, you have to book a place in a quarantine hotel, and you've got to be quarantined for 2 weeks under armed guard. Oh. My daughter went there. What they do is she went there during this period. The whole plane gets taken to the same hotel, right? You can see why they might want to do that. The hotel literally has soldiers outside it because people have escaped from these hotels. And your routine is that you're allowed out of your room for half an hour a day when you get taken to a kind of courtyard, and you can walk around really like prisoners, right? My daughter said that other people were old and they were so slow in the walking, it drove her nuts. So she gave up on the half an hour out of her room, spent 2 weeks in a room. And that's for even if you're a New Zealand citizen, that's the way you're dealt with. The New Zealand citizens, there are many, many thousands, I think tens of thousands of New Zealanders who cannot get back to the country because they can't get a place booked in one of these hotels. So I just want to pick up on something that Sam said about it's like Scotland. New Zealand's more like Scotland in this response. That actually runs a lot deeper than people may realize. And that's because New Zealanders are Scots. New Zealand was the British who, up until the 90s really, New Zealand had 2 populations in it. Well, 3. It had white New Zealanders who were almost entirely of British descent. Very few continental Europeans in New Zealand. And Maori, who, it depends how you count them, but they were probably about 10% of the population, maybe a little less then. And Pacific Islanders, so Polynesians from Samoa, the Cook Islands, Fiji, Tonga. They were maybe 3, 4, or 5% of the population. It's much more mixed up now, much less dominated by white British descent people. But the other thing to note is those British descent people in New Zealand, more of them were from Scotland than from England. And the culture of New Zealand was, broadly speaking, Scottish Presbyterian. So there's always been a puritanical streak in New Zealand public life and New Zealand culture, quite judgmental, quite grim, might be the way of putting it, austere. Now, as New Zealand's developed, as time's come along, it's been, Christianity's fallen away. Very few people believe in God now. But that Presbyterian sentiment is still there. And it finds expression in a kind of aggressive social justice, fairness ideology. And the ideology of fairness is very important in New Zealand politics. Freedom, not at all. If you talk about liberty in New Zealand politics, people laugh. They think you're a crank. I mean, they thought I was a crank. They thought I was a total crackpot. And so it's just not a value. New Zealand is a reasonably free country, but it's not a political value in New Zealand. You don't know. You never hear people talking about it, and you can't make those kinds of arguments and get any traction. If you want to argue against things, you've got to point out that they're unfair, particularly if they're unfair to some group or other. And so it seems it's no surprise that New Zealand political culture and Scottish political culture are quite similar. And they're also similar sized countries.
That's very interesting because obviously the woke ideology, social justice ideology has very much taken hold in Scotland, although you can say
Canada, which is also a Scottish country.
And Canada as well, yes, all these countries. So going back to Jacinda Ardern, now to many she's seen as a liberal left pin-up, as I said before, for the centre left, for leaders like Justin Trudeau, for Sadiq Khan's also spoken about how he wants to work with her and follow her inclusive instincts for a fairer, greener world and all that. It's quite interesting that she seems to me to be one of the most authoritarian liberals I can think of, at least that I know of in the Western world. I mean, we read recently that there's a proposal, I don't know if it's been made into law, to ban sales of cigarettes altogether. Now, is that seen in New Zealand as just, it's the benefit of the collective good, it's the benefit for society, so therefore the individual just doesn't count? Is there a consensus in government that that's the way to go? Is there a consensus in the country that banning things that are bad for you is the way to improve society?
Well, so on the Jacinda point, and I can't think of any leader except maybe Justin Trudeau who's had better press that's more undeserved than Jacinda Ardern has. And I say that not because I'm not partisanly, but even on her own merits. People talk about her being the great liberal leader, but as Jamie already said, she jumped into bed with Winston Peters, whose positions on immigration are frankly more BNP than Nigel Farage. And also, Labour has done some pretty unpleasant things, and even from a purely liberal mindset. I mean, for example, there was a fantastic story about how they produced this report that talked about how there was this huge, so there's a major housing crisis in New Zealand, especially in Auckland. It's not dissimilar to the housing crisis going on in London at the moment. And Labour produced this report that said, the problem is that too many Chinese people are coming in and buying all the houses and then either renting them out to students or moving over here. And that's what's causing the housing crisis. And when people dug down into the report, the way that they discovered that there were too many Chinese people buying houses is that they'd gone through the list of all of the people who had bought houses over the past, can't remember what the period was, 6 months or a year. And they literally highlighted everybody who had a Chinese sounding name and said, this is a foreign Chinese person who's come over here and bought a house. And that was literally how much research they did into it. And they released this, and it got reported everywhere that there were so many Chinese people coming in and buying these houses. But they should add that
subsequently, that was before they got into power. Now they're in power, they had actually banned foreigners from buying land in New Zealand. They're a very anti-foreigner party. It's strange. One of the inversions, and it might surprise British audience, in New Zealand, that the political right is pro-immigration and the political left is hostile to it. This is because the left have got these ideas about kind of fixed pie. They've got a zero-sum mentality, and foreigners come and take right from us. So it's a bit of a surprising inversion to a lot of people overseas to see the left being hostile to immigration and the right being liking it.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. That there's sorry, go on.
Sorry, Emily, but just to actually answer your question. Sorry, I didn't realise I kind of went on a bit on a side point. Yes, there is a real problem in New Zealand about just banning things that are considered to be. So I think New Zealand's got a bit of a again, being a small country, it's very difficult to stand against the mainstream when it comes to the battle of ideas. Basically, as soon as an idea becomes accepted by the media, academia, politicians, it's very difficult to push back against it. And Jamie is right to a point that that National, when they come into power, often just continue with the ideas of Labour. But the opposite is also true, and in many cases it's because there is just a consensus that happens being a small country, and then everybody just carries on with it. So smoking is actually a big one, and again, that sort of it ties in a bit towards with the Maori Party and the strength of the Maori group especially within the Labour Party. So
I think I think that's all true, but I think there's another reason that's quite deep in New Zealand for this kind of welcoming authoritarianism more readily than in America and Britain, let's say. And I think the reason is that New Zealand's a very young country. Its founding document is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed in 1840 it's a treaty between the Crown, the British Crown, and the Maori tribes. Basically, was a settlement between them. I won't go into the details. Maori are very happy with it. They want the treaty honoured. They don't say we don't like the treaty. They say we want it honoured. And it was a very enlightened document for the age. But anyway, New Zealand there were very few whites in New Zealand at that point, and then migration from Britain accelerated. And so it's a very young country, and it's never had kings and dukes and lords who were exploitative, and a population who feels that the government is as a hostile force and a taking thing from them. So in New Zealand, there's a view of the government in New Zealand which I call generally benign. The view that the government is a benign entity that can be trusted. Not so, increasingly so in Britain, but not so historically, right? And not so in many European countries where your governments were a kind of alien force with swords who came and took stuff off you. That's not the view of things in New Zealand. And so it's very difficult to get people to feel they need to defend themselves against the government. And so they kind of go along with all this stuff. And I think that's part of the problem. And again, it's that Presbyterian judginess as well. Like, well, you shouldn't be smoking. It's right that they ban smoking because you shouldn't be doing it. And if you do it, you're an example to children, and that's bad for them, and so on. Another way of thinking of all this, and Jacinda, so people think, isn't it curious that she's both so nice and so authoritarian? Well, no, it's not in the least bit curious. She's the mother of the nation. And aren't good mothers quite bossy with their children? Don't they force their children to do what's good for them? A good mother doesn't let her children smoke, does she? So if you see her as a mother, which is how she sees herself, she's a mother of adult New Zealanders, right? Then it's no surprise whatsoever. And if you have the mother model of government, which increasingly we do, health authoritarianism is one of the least surprising things on earth.
That's very interesting. The parallels with Nicola Sturgeon north of the border are very, very striking there, and also to a lesser extent probably Angela Merkel in that mother figure.
I think it's easier for women to be authoritarian because they're generally perceived as being kinder than men, right? Less threatening, less aggressive. And so if they're being authoritarian, can only be because they mean well, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if a man is authoritarian, maybe he's trying to get one over you. So I think it's much easier to be an authoritarian woman leader than male.
Sorry, Sam, go on.
So, although I think it is getting a lot worse than it was previously. So Helen Clark, who was the previous Labour Prime Minister, the thing that brought her down effectively after, about 9 years in power was that she was considered to be a sort of nanny bossy figure. The things that the kind of thing that eventually broke the back of her government was that she was trying to legislate the size of shower heads people could use, and so I think that there does seem to have be a lot more acceptance of sort of minor nannying in people's lives now.
Yeah, there has been, and that's a global shift, though. I think not just New Zealand. The idea. What isn't the government's business? So, the size of your shower head, right? That's just none of your business, right? I'll have whatever. Well, the idea that some things aren't the government's business, that used to be quite a strong instinct in a lot of people. And they didn't then worked out a theory of it. They weren't Hayekians or anything like that. They just had a gut feeling, right? Like, don't tell me what to do with my shower head. I think now there's really no territory that people think isn't the government's business. For example, what we eat is now considered to be properly the government's business, and many people campaign for the government to take a more active role in determining what we eat. I think if you'd asked somebody 100 years ago, can you imagine the government's going to care, like whether you have sugar or not? They would have been bewildered by this.
This is something I worry about, particularly with the which may be a legacy of the pandemic, that that we embolden those nanny state zealots even more, so that public health, your health, becomes the business of your neighbours and the people next door, and that's one of the consequences of having a national health service.
People don't know what public health means. I had a bizarre kind of spat with a bunch of people online when I said that obesity wasn't a public health issue. Because they think that a public health issue is an issue about health that affects the public, right? But they don't understand that it's public health, the public in public health is the same as the public in public good. It's about health issues where my conduct makes you sick, right? That's what a public health issue is. So the pandemic is a public health issue, but obesity is not a public health issue. But people don't draw that distinction. In fact, they think that anything that burdens the NHS is a public health issue. Therefore, obesity is a public health issue in their thinking because, if a lot of fat people and they burden the NHS. So now the government has a right to do things that make us make us less fat, right? Most people would think that was reasonable, whereas I think it's wholly unreasonable. Once you've got a public health, I always saw this coming. I knew this would come. Once you have a public health system, then anything you do with your own body potentially affects other people, right? Because they may have to pay
everyone else.
And then there is no limit to this externalities argument for intervening in our lives. There's literally no limit, because what is it that I do that doesn't affect my health? My work habits affect my health. My sexual conduct affects my health. My recreational things, what I eat, everything affects my health. So there is, by this rationale, no limit on government. I think the NHS is far worse than people talk about. Is it efficient? What are the standards like, and so on? That's only half the problem with it. The bigger problem, in my view, is that it creates a license for it collectivizes all my choices about what I do with my own body.
Yeah, that's my major concern, and something I've been thinking about a lot as we've seen, so many people on the centre left becoming so judgmental of people's choices over the vaccine. I can just see that, becoming stronger and stronger with smoking, eating, drinking, and so on. People now seem to feel like they have the right to say anything about their other people in society, which is only it's not going to go well, I don't think.
An unvaccinated person occupying a hospital bed, right? This is an outrage, according to these people. Well, why isn't a fat person occupying a hospital bed similarly an outrage? They made choices that ended them up. Why isn't, as you say, smoking? Why isn't it all the same? Why isn't anything apart from the kind of diseases that just come upon you for no reason that you do? 2/3 of cancers have got nothing to do with your lifestyle. So they're acceptable. But anything else just about is unacceptable, right? You've been selfish and the government should stop you.
Right. Well, seeing as we're the IEA, I want to have a little brief talk about the economy in New Zealand. I mean, from what I've read, lockdown has hit the economy very hard. I mean, New Zealand, I don't know what percentage of GDP is down to tourism, but I think it's a significant amount. So obviously that's completely out of the window. Inflation is surging. You've had the Reserve Bank have to hike interest rates twice in 1 month, I believe, in November. I don't know if they've had to do so again. You've had GDP down 3.7% quarter to quarter. So it's not looking great. Does the Labour Party have an economic strategy? What is their economic strategy? And do you think that New Zealand has strong enough economic foundations to turn this around when we come out of these restrictions in New Zealand?
So on the GDP point, I think I've been honestly surprised at how robust the New Zealand economy has been. And the only rationale I can see for this is firstly that farming has remained incredibly strong, and so farming and tourism are both quite significant chunks of the economy, and so I think that's really helped. But also, people not being allowed to leave the country has, funnily enough, encouraged a lot of home tourism. Now, I don't think it doesn't compensate for the sheer numbers of people who used to come in, but I think it has lessened the blow to the tourism industry, because suddenly because New Zealand, up until about I think August or September, it was when they introduced all the lockdowns in New Zealand. Up until that point, New Zealand had been very open and free, so you had a lot of people moving and going on holiday internally. So although there have been a lot of business failures, not sort of a bit like what happened in the UK with the furlough scheme, it's been a lot less than perhaps one might have envisioned at the beginning of the process. Labour's problem, as far as a strategy is concerned, is as far as I can tell, they don't really have one aside from just sort of keep poking the economy every now and then and make sure that, and hope that that does enough to just keep it carrying on automatic. But they're quite keen to just add. It's a bit like the government here, to be honest. They could just keep, putting little additional burdens on businesses, upping the minimum wage, new health and safety problems. Jamie and I, before we came on, were talking about the fact that in New Zealand now, because of the health and safety system, which I won't go into because it's quite a long explanation, but it basically means that if you have workplace accidents occurring, it's dealt with through the criminal law. So if you're a company director and you have workplace safety issues, you can go to jail instead of being sued. So things like this are actually quite significant burdens on New Zealand business. Labour's problem has always been, and I say this with the best will in the world, is they were very good at press releasing, but incredibly bad at delivery. David Farrar, who's he's a very well-known centre-right blogger in New Zealand, produced the sort of graph of Labour Party successes at the last election. And some of the promises versus the actual results after 3 years of Labour in power were remarkably bad. I can't remember these numbers exactly, but they're in the right, quantum. They promised to build something like 20,000 houses by 2021, and they built 360. And things that they promised to finish building light rail between central Auckland and Auckland Airport, and all they've produced in the past 4 years has been 7 meters worth of press releases. I read somewhere online. So, and just thing after thing after thing. The amount of coal burnt in New Zealand power plants has gone up. The emissions have gone up. And I assume
so it is fair to say there's a lot of virtue signalling over substance.
They've got a big problem that they can't do anything. That it's not. People go on, oh, they're incompetent, right? But I don't like this incompetence argument about governments because it suggests that governments should be doing things. The reason they can't succeed, they can't get anything done, there are two. One is that they don't believe in free markets and open economies. They don't believe in all that stuff. On the other hand, they know that if they nationalize everything and try to do what's kind of in their guts, it'll bring economic ruin. So they've got nowhere to go, right? They've got nothing to do. So they just tinker, as Sam said. But they've got another problem. And there's a big problem that doesn't get discussed much in New Zealand, which is the Resource Management Act. It was introduced. Both parties are responsible for this legislation. Labour drew it up in the late 80s and the National Party implemented it in the early 90s. And it is the kind of planning rules in Britain that stifle development here. It's like that on steroids. And it allows people to stop. It gives enormous power to NIMBYs. And in particular, the difference between some of it's environmental, some of it's to do with Maori cultural rights. And if you want to do anything in New Zealand, like develop anything, you've got to get the local iwi, these are the Maori tribes, to give you permission. And of course, how do you imagine you get that permission? Well, it's expensive, and this stifles development. And the Labour Party in government has only made matters worse. There was a terrible incident where a company had bought a lot of land not too far from the airport in Auckland that they were going to develop, build housing, apartments, that kind of stuff. It was that they owned the land fair and square. They'd been through the whole Treaty of Waitangi processes, and they owned it, kosher, no problem. Bunch of Maori occupied the land, claiming that this company didn't have the right to develop it. The Maori somehow had some rights over the land still, even though they didn't legally. The Prime Minister intervened, bought the land using taxpayers' money and gave it to the Maoris who were occupying the land. Now, not only is it outrageous from a rule of law point of view, it creates terrible incentives and signals to developers. So this whole, unless the Resource Management Act is repealed, which I campaigned, I think I'm the only person who's ever campaigned on that in New Zealand, it should just be out and out repealed. None of these problems are going to get solved. You can't. The government can't build I mean, when the government says we're going to build a whole lot of houses, the NIMBYs can stop that just as easily as if private developers are going to do it. So saying, oh, we'll do it with the government doesn't solve the problem unless you repeal the Resource Management Act, which they won't, especially in bed with the Greens. Of course they're not going to do it, right? The Greens would go nuts.
Right. So just to finish, as Sam, you can add to your final remarks. I just wanted to ask, will 2022 be a better year for New Zealand? Do you see it opening up, going back to normal? Do you see the centre-right potentially gaining more popularity and becoming the main parties and taking power? Or do you think Jacinda Ardern has a few more years in her and will continue to hold her prime ministership? What are your thoughts on 2022? Sam?
Well, I think, Jacinda's there for at least 2 more years because unfortunately we had a general election last year. So New Zealand only has 3-year terms, so hopefully it won't be too long before the next election rolls around, and we can hopefully replace Labour with a more centre-right government. There does seem to be some hope for improvement. So the big problem with that, briefly, was that National and ACT were doing quite well around men, but doing very badly amongst women, and this was despite having a female leader. But as Jamie said, she was a bit Marmite. She certainly rubbed some people up the wrong way, and it seemed like one of those groups was women especially under the age of 50. I think Labour was ahead by something like 70 points amongst women, women under the age of 50. And that seems to have changed somewhat since the new leader came in. Now, I don't know how long, if this is a honeymoon or if we will, that will rub off over the next 2 years before the next election. But there does seem like that the big group of people that was holding Labour at an incredibly high level in the polls is willing to give the centre-right another look now that the leader's changed. So I think in the last polls before Christmas, something along the lines of Labour and the Greens together. So New Zealand's got 120 seats in Parliament. Labour and the Greens together had, I think, 60. National and ACT had 58, and the Maori Party had 2. Was broadly what the polling is. So there isn't a lot that needs to change for National and ACT to be able to form a government after the next election, and I'm hopeful that they'll be able to do it.
Yeah, I think they will. I suspect that they will, but not for a good reason. It's not because the population will have thought all this nannying is a terrible thing and we must get away from it. We don't need a mother. We are mothers and fathers. We don't need another. They won't be for that reason. It'll just be because the economy's tanked. Yeah. I'm with Sam when he said, I was surprised by how well it stood up, but I think the reason is, like everywhere, GDP figures don't reflect government debt. So if you borrow a whole lot of money or print a whole lot of money and pay people to do nothing, and it covers up problems for a while, right? You're still getting, output does go down, but not as much as it might have. It papers things over. And then, but of course, a day of reckoning comes. You get inflation, and interest rates go up, and all sorts of things happen. You've had a misallocation of capital in the economy, and you start to see the effects. And we're starting to see that. And we're starting to see inflation all around the world. And so I'm pessimistic about the bounce back, especially since you won't get the kind of reforms that would help. And another thing that New Zealand has very poor productivity figures, very low output per worker in New Zealand. And no government has addressed this. Even the previous national government didn't really. So I don't know. And it's a very open economy, as pointed out. I think something like 50% of New Zealand output is traded, is exported, and we import a lot. And so this has been it's bad. I think it's going to be very bad, and that's why you'll get a change in government. Hopefully, I mean, in a funny way, I kind of hope not. Right? Obviously, I don't want things to be bad, and so in a way, if Jacinda is still there at the end of the next election, that's a good sign.
Well, I hope you get to return to New Zealand at some point. I'm sure you've both got a family and friends.
It's too risky.
Over there. Too risky. You might not be allowed out.
Yeah. I don't think they have export. They don't. You are permitted to leave. You just can't come back. So New Zealanders don't leave because they can't get back. But I suppose if I was willing to spend 2 weeks in a hotel, the thing is that if you're going to spend 2 weeks in a hotel, you have to be going for months to make it worthwhile.
Oh yeah, exactly. God, I can't imagine anything worse than having to quarantine in a hotel just to return to my own country. That would be infuriating. I just wouldn't go out of principle. I'd wait a few years. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me to talk about New Zealand. It was enlightening and I learnt a lot, and I'm sure our viewers will as well. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. Thanks very much for watching.